Good morning. I'm Stanley Smith, and I'm here with John Cape, and we're looking at the topic of climate and weather. And John is an energy expert, and just described himself to me a few minutes ago is really a student of the topic and narrative of climate. So, John, why don't you introduce your topic, and we'll get into your slide presentation.
Yeah, I'm going to answer, I guess, a couple questions that Stanley posed to me regarding what's going on with anthropogenic global warming or climate change, or whatever your favorite term of the week is. And his request to have me respond to these questions was actually very stimulating, because it gave me a chance to go look through my notes and look at my slides and honestly review a couple presentations that I hadn't even seen before. So there's actually a lot of material out there. And the trick is being able to find it, which isn't easy if you go searching for something on Google or some other search engine. It's kind of buried, and you have to look carefully, but it's out there, believe me. All right, so we're going to just call this a high-level discussion on high-level questions related to climate and weather.
Okie doke.
And the questions are in blue in this presentation. So here was the first question that Stanley posited to me. He said, climate and weather changes. We all experience this, and science tells us this, but so what? That's a great question, actually. And I had to go back, think deeply about that. I think I've actually come up with 4 different ways to respond to this question, but here's my most recent, okay? The next slide shows something that came from a presentation that Richard Lindzen did. He did it for the Irish Climate Science Forum, which is actually a terrific link. If you ever go to that link, there's great presentations there. And he's showing what basically the seasonal temperature anomalies look like. And so this is in the background there. You see what the temperatures are actually doing, and this is on a seasonal basis, and this is comparing a bunch of stations. And you see there's a lot of movement in what the stations are actually doing above or below what the normal temperature might be. And then when you start looking at the differences, year to year or season to season, that's what's showed there in the yellow. So you're sort of looking at how much variability there is within a given season on weathers, but that yellow line there is sort of how much the anomaly actually is. And if you look at the slide, it shows that when you basically explode that and expand it very large, it looks ominous. But when you look at in the context of how much the temperatures just vary in our daily lives, higher or lower than what's normal, the graph we just looked at, that little yellow line looks insignificant. But when you blow it up, you can make it seem like it's hugely important and
I see.
Very, very important. And so it's this sense of context of how do you frame a certain issue so it looks a lot bigger than it actually, a lot more important than it actually is. Now the next slide was one of the favorite ones I found today, and this came it was from the same lecture from Richard Lindzen, who's a climate scientist at MIT, or actually he's an emeritus climate scientist at MIT. And what he sort of shows is what temperatures do people learn to live with? So there in the far left, you see he's got global warming over the last 120 years, and it's damn close to zero. And he's saying, okay, now let's look at the temperature variation between 8 o'clock in the morning and 10 o'clock in the morning. Okay, sunrise to afternoon, January to July afternoon, yearly average of the coldest to the hottest, all-time coldest to hottest. We are perfectly capable of responding to all of these variable temperature variations. And yet we're told that little variation over there at the far left is a climate emergency. And I think Richard did a great job of putting this into context, showing that a lot of the hype we get is exactly that. It's hype.
Yeah, that's very scathing, John.
Yeah, the next slide comes from pretty much the same website where they've got another one of these lectures. This one's from John Christie, and he's a climate scientist at UH that works a lot with the satellites. And this one shows sort of what what does the heat look like from the vantage point of what's going to and from space, what's getting wrapped up or involved in the atmosphere where the greenhouse gases are, and what's happening at the surface of the Earth. So at the surface, coming down from the sun, you see you got 47 units there on the far left, and you got 23 units actually that get caught up in the atmosphere, caught up in those greenhouse gases on its way down. From the Earth, you see the evaporation going back up. You see flux from the Earth, and that's pretty much heat generated from the hot core of our planet. So our planet's actually radiating heat as well. You see 105 units of infrared radiation being sent back, and it's met with 100 units coming down back from the atmosphere. And then on the far right, it's hard to see that under the, it looks just, I guess it's infrared radiation that manages to avoid the atmosphere altogether and just go straight to outer space, is what that shows.
Wow, that's fascinating, John.
And these all basically counterbalance, heat increase or decrease is a function of balance. Does the heat that was introduced to the system was allowed to escape the system? If it wasn't, then it creates something that creates residual heat and creates warmth over time. Now he provides the same sort of data separately. He shows what happens in the next graph.
John, just before we leave this one, so you're saying that there's radiation and heat and generated from the Earth itself, going out up into the atmosphere and then out into space. Is that correct?
Well, yes, but so what greenhouse gases do, they sort of get excited and they heat up a little bit. And then they radiate heat back out when they lose that excitement. Some of that heat goes back to the Earth, and some of it goes to outer space. It's what gives us the greenhouse gas effect.
Very interesting.
The stimulation of these greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And so you see that climate sensitivity reference that was the top of that. That's the amount that is generated out of space. And so his comment in the atmosphere is that with man-made carbon dioxide emissions, it actually is worth the equivalent of a single unit being sent down for the atmosphere toward the planet. But you see that's like 1 unit out of 147 being sent up from Earth. And to put that in context is what's on the next slide. This is just showing a tug of war. And on the left, we have the cooling losses. So you see that big 105 radiation loss we saw. Offset that's that downward atmosphere radiation that's coming down from the clouds. We've got the evaporation over to the left. We've got the heat flux over to the right. We've got the solar radiation going back to space. And that little bitty guy on the far right there, that's basically the size of man-made carbon dioxide emissions. And so with a system this large, with the ability of the atmosphere to just send more heat to space at any time, or if the heat flux were to heat up for some reason, you could absorb that and send more to space. But that little bitty impact over there to the far right, we're told that's the planet's thermostat. And it's just one of a lot of other forces that counteract each other in our climate. So this is, of course, an oversimplification. It's good for laymen like me, but you get the idea that the size of the man-made carbon dioxide emissions is relatively small in the scheme of the big system.
Yeah, that's really, it's like way out of scale.
Yeah. Now this next graph came from Roy Spencer. He works with John Christie as a scientist at UAH in Alabama, and he's saying, what exactly is uncertain? And the natural causes that explain most of the climate change that's always happened are mostly not really well understood. We can't recreate those. We can't really model those natural processes very well. We can't go back in history and replicate those with our models because we don't really understand them. Climate can change from any forcing. And a chaotic system, butterfly waves its wings in Japan, and next thing we know, we got a tornado in Oklahoma. The forcings are kind of just hard to predict. And his point here is that, basically, this is a picture of a glacier in Alaska. And it says the retreating Alaska glacier reveals a medieval forest. So that glacier was there, but 1,000 years ago, it wasn't there. 1,000 years ago, that climate was a forest. And so the point is climate does change, and it's changed quite a bit based upon natural causes, as your references. Now, the next slide deals with sort of what the popular claims are that we hear a lot in the media. The first one there was the hottest, last year was the hottest year ever. And it's the empirical reality, it's like by 100th of a degree. It's within the error bar of what the claim was. Did you actually feel that 100th of a degree there, in that hottest year? Wildfires are increasing. Well, global wildfires have not increased. That's the statistical analysis of the frequency of global wildfires. What has increased is the regional increases in forest mismanagement, when people don't clear the dry wood out of the forest, or people choose to live in the forest, in the midst of all these concerns. Storms are worsening. The reality, storm intensity has not changed. Crops are failing. No, actually, global crop yields are continuing to break records. Humans are suffering. Well, cold kills a lot more people than heat. No climate deaths. Poverty, not weather, is the greatest threat to human flourishing.
Yeah.
And this notion that we only have 10 years left, like John Kerry recently said again. Well, we've only had 10 years left for the past 50 years or more. So they're sort of claiming the sky is falling, and it gets old after a while, but this is what we do in fact hear all the time. Now the next graph, up you one, I think. Was that on purpose?
What's that? Did I miss one?
There's one right above that, I think.
This one? Sorry.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. So the overview, this is kind of the summary of what, in this case, Roy Spencer, believed is what the reality is of climate change. He says slow warming is occurring, but not as fast as climate models forecast. Certainly by less than 50%, maybe a lot less, depends on what your assumptions are. The cause of that warming could be partly from CO2, but we don't really know how much. A lot of uncertainty there. Most media reports and predictions are exaggerated or wrong, which means we got a lot of misinformed Americans. Number 4, there is no convincing evidence of more severe weather. So all these claims of extreme weather, hurricanes, floods, droughts, all that stuff basically isn't statistically evident that any single event we have is abnormal. Now, the next one, the cost of renewables remains high. And in this, he means the wind and the solar, which it seems to be the primary focus of people. And the physics prevent widespread displacement of fossil fuels with wind or solar. So it's physics, and the physics is what causes that. And so his bottom line is there is no climate crisis or emergency. And this is from a guy that actually gets involved with the satellites that measure global temperatures all the time. The next slide, I found an interesting metaphor from Richard Lindzen again. And what he says, in the case of this climate change narrative, there is the government response. It is entirely analogous to a situation that a colleague, Bruce Everett, described. After your physical, your physician tells you that you may have a fatal disease. He's not really sure, but he proposes a treatment that will be expensive and painful while offering no prospect of preventing the disease. Mm-hmm. When you ask why you would ever agree to such a thing, he says, he just feels obligated to do something. And that is precisely what the Paris Accord amounts to. However, the something also gives governments the power to control the energy sector. And this is something many governments cannot resist because energy is wealth. Energy is control. Energy is pretty much our standard of living these days. Information is unlikely to change this, despite the fact that even the UN acknowledges that their models would project like a 2 or 3% impact by the end of the century. That is pretty trivial in the big scheme of things. So the next question was the one that had to do with how has the AGW narrative made for good policy and how does anyone benefit from it? I'm going to give you a pretty short answer on this. It's the next slide, and this one came from Roy Spencer again from his presentation. And he says, the prophets, depending on how you want to call them, the prophets of doom, will continue. The climate change, sustainability, social responsibility narratives are strong and profitable. And they are coming from the climate modelers, the people who have proposed these models that are 2, 3, 4 times higher than what actual temperature observations have done. They get paid a lot of money to create these models, and it helps them quite a bit. The education system, they're benefiting quite a bit from these narratives, maybe extra funding from the government. The news media, they're the ones that sensationalize every headline. Every news event is being caused by something big and ominous they can talk about frequently. The entertainment industry, movies about this and other things, other crises that show the world's facing its next Armageddon. Political leaders and government agencies, to include both United Nations and other levels. Government grants, programs, and mandates. This is mostly what scientists get. They get rewarded for being able to take this stuff on. Rent seekers, people that basically are making a lot of money from installing wind and solar panels and getting paid subsidies for years, despite no benefit other than driving the price of electricity higher. And an increasing number of activist corporations, people like Greenpeace, that want to try to get rid of chlorine because it's a poison, without really recognizing that chlorine is the base for a lot of our medicine and the safety of our water system. And an increasingly frightened and guilt-ridden public that thinks I ought to do something. Let's send one of these groups our money. And so I think this is a nice recap. Now, the next slide was sort of something that came from a guy who was instrumental in starting the IPCC back in the day. And this is from Maurice Strong. He was the chairman of the first international meeting on global warming. And his comment in that meeting was, isn't the only hope for the planet that the industrialized civilizations collapse? Isn't it our responsibility to bring that about? And so some people see this whole climate movement as a way to impose a global government on the citizens of the earth, so they don't have to contend with our democratic process in the United States. They would be the ones in charge, of course, at least in their estimation. And it's not at all encouraging. Now, I've got about a dozen more of those kind of presentations, these kind of quotes, but I took them out of this presentation. We're going to spend the rest of our time on that third question you brought up. And this question is climate change just another fancy, our pictures are under it. Is climate change just another fancy white person's issue that distracts us actually helping those in need? Well, let's look at the next slide. Next slide says, this was from John Christie. And he says the Chinese lifted 400 million people out of poverty by building a coal-fired power plant every week. Viewed as bad by the very wealthy environmental activists, viewed as good by the 400 million human beings who no longer living in poverty, by many millions more who strive to end their poverty. So no one wants to be poor. And so this is just saying that, you know, fossil fuels have allowed us to achieve a planet with 7.5 billion people. Maybe we shouldn't so quickly be willing to throw fossil fuels under bus unless we really do have a viable replacement, and wind and solar is not that. Slide 17, the next one. This talks about a gentleman named C.P. Snow that gave a lecture back in 1959 called The Two Cultures. And Richard Lindzen's used this a couple times in his presentation. And I'm gonna just give you a flavor of what he's talking about here. He says, why is it that the educated elites are more vulnerable about absurd narratives than most ordinary people? That's kind of the question he's raising as he brings this up. And from C.P. Snow, he says, a good many times I have been present at gatherings of people who, by the standards of the traditional culture, are thought highly educated and who have, with considerable gusto, been expressing their incredulity at the illiteracy of scientists. Once or twice, I have been provoked and have asked the company how many of them could describe the second law of thermodynamics. The response was cold. It was also negative, yet I was asking something which is the scientific equivalent of, have you read a work of Shakespeare? I now believe that if I had asked an even simpler question, such as, what do you mean by mass, acceleration, or the scientific equivalent of saying, can you read? Not more than 1 in 10 of the highly educated would have felt that I was speaking the same language. So the great edifice of modern physics goes up. And the majority of the cleverest people in the Western world have about as much insight into it as their Neolithic ancestors would have. So this is sort of an introductory set of remarks that Richard has, and he brings that to set out the next set of remarks on the next slide.
John, that kind of points up to the idea of, as you described yourself as a student. It's a student is naturally open to new ideas, whereas an expert, I mean, I guess they're thoroughly invested in whatever their belief system is.
Yeah, well, I think many people are invested in what they know or don't know, but here's one of the things that Richard Lindzen said about those educated elites. I'm having a hard time getting the slides. I'm gonna try to bring this up on my second screen here. Excuse me a second.
I think you can move your photo box around if you need to on your screen.
Can I? Okay.
Yeah, I'm trying to leave mine out of the way for the viewer in most instances.
All right, let me bring it. I'm sorry.
That's all right.
So I can just move this thing.
You can move. Yeah, you can move your.
Sweet. Okay, perfect. All right.
Photos.
Now I can see the slide about those educated elites. Okay, here's what Richard Lindzen said. What C.P. Snow failed to note, I think, is that the group he describes is actually aware of their scientific ignorance. And this leaves them very insecure. This accounts for their need of simple narratives, however wrong. It allows them to believe that they actually do understand the science. And as we see, they become arrogantly proud of their alleged accomplishment. Of course, they forget that their ignorance extends to understanding what science actually is. They forget that the opposite of science is the science. The situation is compounded when it comes to climate, where most scientists are ignorant, but where their support for the narrative comforts the non-scientists. On top of all this, I suspect in a long period of well-being, this elite feels the need to show that they have met challenges, even if the challenges are purely imaginary. This seems particularly true for young people who are confronted with stories of the courage of the greatest generation. And then he goes on and notes, he says, one should note again that most ordinary people don't have these problems. So part of what Richard believes is instrumental, and this goes back to your question, and this whole climate change narrative, are these educated elites that have grasped on to these opinions as if they're gospel and are not available to be challenged. They're politically correct. You're not allowed to offer any counter opinion to what they're sharing with you. And that's not what science is at all. Science is basically the expectation of criticism, to try to come up with what's wrong with a given hypothesis, not to blindly accept it and treat it like gospel. And I think this is a powerful observation, which goes exactly to your question. You know, that this is the source of that narrative. This is the group that believes that they've got something on the rest of us. And I think that's also why so many common people in the conservative side are saying, this is crazy. I'm a farmer. This is not the way the world works. And they recognize what's really going on. But these educated elites, they're kind of using this to make us all think that they're geniuses, when in fact they're almost like the emperor that was wearing the invisible clothes.
Yeah, that's really something to ponder, this whole idea of this long period of well-being. The elites feel they need to show they've met challenges. That's very interesting, John.
Yeah.
That really speaks to my question about the, I mean, I'm using the term fancy white people as kind of pejorative, of course, but the idea of people who have privilege, I mean, they have unfortunately, there's an arrogance that comes with that. It's just very unappealing.
Yeah. And this was another quote from Richard Lindzen. He says, if this weren't silly enough, we were bombarded with claims that the impact of this climate change includes such things as obesity and the Syrian civil war. The claims of impacts are then circularly claimed to be overwhelming evidence of dangerous climate change. It doesn't matter that most of these claims are wrong or relevant. It doesn't matter that none of these claims can be related to CO2 except via model projections. In almost all cases, even the model projections are non-existent. Somehow, the sheer volume of misinformation seems to overwhelm us. In case you retain any skepticism, there is John Kerry's claim that climate, unlike physics and chemistry, is simple enough for any child to understand. presumably, if you can't see the existential danger of CO2, you're a stupid denier.
Wow. Well, here we are.
I think some of these are getting to your question, are they not? Okay,
Yes.
let's try the next one. Okay, here's the similarities between eugenics and climate change movements. And this again was Richard Lindsay.
Yes.
It says, number one, elites are always searching for ways to advertise their virtue and assert the authority they believe they are entitled to. So there's the privileged class we're talking about. They want to show us they're in charge. Number two, they view science as a source of authority rather than a process. And they try to appropriate science, suitably and incorrectly simplified, as the basis for their movement.
That's
Number
excellent.
three, movements need goals. And these goals are generally embedded in legislation. And in case of eugenics, it was sort of the simple-mindedness notion that we had to purify our races or something, or keep certain elements out of the country. And so the legislation in that case was the immigration policy for the US, steered away from people from Eastern Europe or Southern Europe at that time.
Yes.
The effect of the legislation long outlasts the alleged science. And number five, as long as scientists are rewarded for doing so, they are unlikely to oppose the exploitation of science.
Well, because that's the part where they get the funding for it. So that's the part that's kind of the mad cow disease of that vicious cycle.
It's exactly right. And then this was how Richard Lindzen started off this presentation today. And I think it's illustrative that he's been a guy who's basically been doing some very even-handed defending, pointing out, some of the uncertainty, pointing out some of the technical issues on a very, very clear scientific basis based on his expertise. But this is how he started off that presentation. He goes, for about 33 years, many of us have been battling against climate hysteria. We have correctly noted the exaggerated sensitivity, and this is the sensitivity to CO2 doubling, which is what was in the first part of that weather slide that John Christie gave us. The role of other processes, a natural internal variability, the inconsistency with the paleoclimate record, historical geology.
Yes.
It's not taking that in consideration. It's not taking all the previous climate change that's happened continuously for 4.5 billion years. And the absence of evidence for increased extreme weather. The fact that statistically, it's pretty consistent with what it's been doing for most of the last 100 years. We've also pointed out the very real benefits of CO2 and even of modest warming. And as concerns government policies, we have been pretty ineffective. Indeed, our efforts have done little other than to show incorrectly that we take the threat scenario seriously. In this talk, I want to make a tentative analysis of our failure. The fact that trying to sort of be a very considerate responder, trying to be a scientist, treating these guys seriously, when they're out there trying to discredit anyone who raises skepticism and attack those people and tell us things like the science is settled and simplify this narrative so that we have a child from Scandinavia, lecturing the rest of the world on global warming.
Oh, yes. That was especially hard to take.
It was especially hard to take. And so this is the final slide of his presentation. And what he's saying here is that our task is to show the relevant people the overall stupidity of this issue, rather than punching away at details. And focusing on the details, we are merely trying to showcase our own specialties. My use of the word merely is probably unjustified. The details can, in fact, be scientifically important. However, we are not considering either our target audience or the intrinsic absurdity of this issue. It is likely that we have to capitalize on the insecurity of the educated elite and make them look silly instead of superior and virtuous. We must remember that they are impervious to real science unless it is reduced to their level. When it is reduced to their level, it is imperative that we retain veracity. Whether we are capable of effectively doing this is an open question. In other words, we need to be very firm about saying that most of this climate stuff is not reasonable. Now, this is the final slide in his presentation. And he goes, Actually, this is from Roy Spencer's presentation. There's no climate crisis, but there will be humanitarian crisis if we allow the warmongers to get their way. The warmongers are these people that are telling us that the temperature's hotter. Temperature's going to run away on us. And
interesting, John. Well, that was, of course, the important conclusion that we're missing other important topics in the world with this undue focus on one side of the climate change story, which was also the other subtext of your presentation here, that there are many people doing good work and good science on this topic, but we don't hear any of those voices. So that was kind of a story within a story, because that, I think when we started this series, I thought, well, why are we even talking about this? Because, you know, we're told over and over again that this has been decided. There is no debate anymore. But in talking to you, I realized that there is a lot of debate out there, just none of us hear anything about it.
Well, that's part of the reason I'm writing this novel. You know, it's a novel where the theme is in fact net zero. And I'm not going to tell you much about what the story is trying to do, but basically, it's also going to serve as a vehicle to allow people to see some of these better quotes of some of the people that are putting up very intelligent criticism and skepticism to what's going on in the world in general with this. In addition, at the back of the book, I've got a lot of references, and I've even got a quote from Michael Crichton, who, if you remember the State of Fear book he produced back in about 2004, that was a book where he basically identified, you know, environmentalists run amok. You know, it was about evil environmentalists in that book, and he had a nice section back talking about eugenics. I've seen a couple of lectures where Michael Crichton also took the stand with Philip Stott and other people, and defended, you know, the fact that we were being oversold the entire climate change narrative. And unfortunately, neither Michael Crichton or Philip Scott are with us anymore. And I'm hoping that this isn't a lethal exercise for me to be involved in.
Maybe you should use a pseudonym, John.
Yeah, maybe so. Maybe so.
And then will this be a steamy pot boiler, or what will this be?
Well, I've tried to put as much sex in there as I can.
But that's always good. That always helps it sell.
Yeah.
Fly off the shelves, John.
There wasn't much in the last one.
And it will be printed on acid-free, carbon-neutral paper, I assume.
Well, I mean, it could actually be electronic. You know, that could even be more sustainable, right?
As long as it's not wind-generated electricity, John.
Well, if it happens to catch the wind when it's blowing, that's great. I don't mind using it.
John, thank you so much for giving us this very concise and for looking at those questions. I really appreciate that. I do think that was helpful, because it did show some of the arrogance and the pretension in the people who do discuss this topic with such veracity of and one-sidedness. And it also points up the fact that we're missing other topics in the world and other more areas of need and deprivation of people that we actually could be focusing on to help people. So I thought those were important takeaways. And I'm going to encourage people to look at our other more in-depth interviews we've done, people who really want to do a deep dive into the specifics of some of the details. But I think this was a good conclusion to our series, because it's beyond the details and more into the philosophy and the underlying principles, with the call to actions which you gave at the end, which I thought were very, very helpful. So I thank you for that, John.
Well, thank you for the great questions. I appreciate the thought stimulus.
Thanks again. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.